We're in Mexico City, one of my favourite races on the calendar, not just because of the interesting track layout and all of the history, but also because of the altitude, and that is a big factor. But before we get into any of that, well, slightly into that anyway, I want to spoil Alex Albon's day. Yep, Alex Albon in a recent interview was saying that he holds the outright speed record in a Formula One car. Alex, I'm sorry to tell you this, but you don't. You do hold probably the outright speed record in this generation of car, but the outright speed record was set at this circuit in a Williams, but by Valtteri Bottas and not you. Sorry, Alex, but to find out more about how fast your car can go this weekend, we spoke to one of your team, Paul Williams, down in the pit lane.
I think last year Alex was quick in Vegas, so I think it was 369 in the race, quite specific circumstances. So there was a 6-car DRS train that he managed to hold that position for the length of the straight. So whether or not we'll see that broken remainder this year, I think here potentially not. It's difficult to follow during the opening phases of the race. Potentially in 4 weeks' time we might challenge that, but we'll have to wait and see.
So then what is the top speed for a Formula One car on a race weekend? Well, it's 372.5 kph, set by Valtteri Bottas on this very circuit in 2016, of course, driving a Williams. Now, I'm sure in the comments people are going to mention the record of 378 kph at Baku. Actually, I've looked into this and I believe that record isn't accurate. There was a bit of a glitch in the data there and the car didn't quite achieve that top speed. So why is it that the cars are achieving Monza, the fastest circuit in Formula One, level speeds with Monaco levels of downforce on their car? Well, it is all about altitude, and I'm not talking about flights in and out of Mexico City Airport. I'm talking about the fact that this track itself is basically on top of a mountain. It sits over 2 kilometers above sea level, and you compare that to Monaco, which is probably about 1.5 meters above sea level. Monaco, you have a lot of aerodynamic drag from the big wing packages they run on the car, but because the circuit's so tight and twisty, that dirty downforce is acceptable. Well, at Mexico City, because of the lack of air density, those big wings are needed just to create a bit of downforce. And to understand a little bit more about the trade-offs between air density and downforce levels and cooling, Paul Williams had a lot more to say down in the pit lane.
So the cooling changes are driven by the altitude here. So Mexico City sat 2,200 meters above sea level, so low air density. So simply there's just less air going through the car. So the changes you see behind us are to open up the exits, so we have the largest louver panels on, which allow more mass flow through the cooling system and allow us to run the power unit where it needs to be. So we develop the car around a nominal cooling level, and the further away from that nominal level you move, the more performance you lose, because the rest of the aerodynamics is developed around that. So in terms of drag level, it's a relatively small amount. We actually lose more performance from the downforce loss at the rear of the car because of the exit flow from those louvers.
Well, that's all absolutely fascinating, isn't it? And I wanted to take a look at the cooling setup on the Williams that they've introduced for this weekend. It's actually a set of new parts on the car, and it may seem pretty minor. You can see it here looking from the rear wing forwards on the car, and you can see the new cooling louver layouts here on the side of the bodywork. It doesn't look too significant. You can just about see some of those heat exchangers, the radiators, if you will, through those slots in the bodywork. But when you look at it from the side of the car, you see how dramatic this set of cooling louvers is all along the bodywork. Now, the Williams is a pretty low drag car inherently, hence those high top speeds it's always achieving. And this set of louvers probably is pretty draggy, but Williams is able to get away with a fairly draggy cooling setup because, well, every other car is more draggy than the Williams to start with, and when there's not much of a drag penalty because of the altitude, you can do something like this. But Williams are not alone in this. But before I get onto that, I'll show you what Williams' cooling layout normally looks like. So here you go. You can see just a little set of louvers around the sponsor logo here, but you can just about make out that this update has been planned for a long time because you can see the interchangeable panel all the way along the side of the bodywork like that on Carlos Sainz's car. And so when they get to this circuit, well, they just opened it all up. So that is the nature of the cooling changes for Williams. Of course, Williams aren't alone in the pit lane upgrading their car for this weekend. In fact, the biggest number of upgrade parts of any team on the grid is Red Bull Racing. Max Verstappen, of course, in that fight for the Drivers' Championship. And having a look at some of their cooling louvers, yes, they've changed their slots, they've changed how much they're opening up the rear bodywork on the car. In fact, from some angles, you can almost see the Honda logos inside the bodywork. In fact, you can see the Honda logo on the top of the power unit just there underneath that bodywork, and that is quite open. And when you see it from the rear, you can really start to see how open that section of the bodywork actually is. Then down here at the rear of the car, you can just about make it out here. They've got an extra cooling slot. Well, they use it quite often, but they've made it a bit bigger here just to extract a little bit more air out from underneath the bodywork. And in the same vein, they've also opened up the top of the rear bodywork here behind the Honda logo, and that just lets a bit more air out from underneath the bodywork. But Red Bull's changes are not just limited to cooling this weekend. Surprisingly, or not surprisingly if you want to win the World Drivers' Championship, Red Bull have introduced a few more interesting bits on the car. And to explain a little bit more about them, it's our good friend Paul Monaghan, who's down in the pit lane, sort of answering the questions as he always does.
You may have noticed we're slightly above sea level here, so there's not an awful lot of air to work with. You can take a choice, detune the engine a bit, run it a bit hot. What we've chosen to do is, it comes out of the last sort of top body evaluation when we were looking for a little bit more efficient cooling. One of the lessons that came out of that, albeit too late, was, we could possibly shuffle this around. And with some magical work in Milton Keynes, we have it here, and we can get a little bit more, or we had slightly less loss with a larger opening at the back, a little bit of fiddling on the inlet, and we're away. So what we've done is there's a slight junction change between side pod and floor, which is all part of this fun and games with the cooling. A previous generation of floor can be recycled because it's slightly modular, its construction. So we've managed to get it all here. It's a tiny performance gain, which is very nice, and then the efficiency with the cooling, and hopefully it's a little bit better.
Well, as ever, absolutely great insight there from Paul Monaghan, who always has something worth listening to. Though it's not always the straight answer to the question you ask, but it's always something interesting, as I say. But to look at Red Bull's coolers and compare them to what we normally see, so here we are, this is the section I'm talking about here. They have changed that, they're not alone in the pit lane on that. And take a look from the rear, you can see that's their normal cooling layout. You can again see that Honda logo on the power unit underneath the bodywork. I guess that's why the power unit manufacturers do have their names on the top of the designs that you're not supposed to see, but still, you can see it and it's quite interesting. In free practice 2, Red Bull revised the cooling layout again and added an additional set of louvers. You can just see that here. But as I said, Red Bull aren't alone in having upgraded parts for the cooling systems of their cars on the grid. Let's have a look at Ferrari, because Ferrari is quite an interesting case. Now, this is the Ferrari layout for this weekend, and you can see very much open, very big cooling louvers, and Ferrari have been mucking about with their cooling louvers all year. Quite often you'll see the two drivers running different cooling setups, and sometimes you'll see a very asymmetric layout between the two cars. And I think you see a quite asymmetric layout here. It's a little bit more subtle than normal, but I think here you can see that this section on the right-hand side is a little bit more open than it is on the left-hand side. And it becomes a little bit more obvious, and I don't think this is just a trick of the light or a camera angle thing. You can see this set of 4 louvers further forwards on the side pod. Compare it to the ones on the left-hand side, they're slightly smaller. There's still 4 of them, but they do have a slightly smaller volume. So I think whatever Ferrari is cooling in the left-hand side pod compared to the right-hand side pod, well, the left-hand side pod has less cooling demand than the right. And that's not unusual. Most F1 cars have different coolers on the right-hand side to the left-hand side, meaning that each side of the car has slightly different levels of cooling, and to the point where you sometimes see what I used to call Quasimodo cars. I think one of the McLarens back in 2008, 2009 from the rear quite often had a very offset rear end, but not so much obvious anymore. But let's have a look at a bit more close detail at some of those details. There's those little cooling slots on the top of the side pod of the Ferrari. And this is one of the areas of the 2022 to 2025 generation of cars that Ferrari have really led on. And it's this shape at the top of the side pod. It's not particularly obvious in this shot, but you can just about see it, where the top of the side pod has a slight sort of soap dish or slight gully along the top. It's something other teams have now taken a lot further, but this is a drag-reducing shape that Ferrari introduced, and it was sort of one of those aspects of the car that everybody sort of copied ever since. Still a lovely piece of design, that's why I talk about it. But sticking with the Ferrari engined cars, but not necessarily Ferrari, let's have a look at the Sauber, because Sauber have introduced a new cooling package this weekend as well. This isn't this weekend, this shot was taken at the Spanish Grand Prix much earlier in the year. Now, it was a hot weekend, it always is in Barcelona, but I thought I'd draw your attention to the cooling slots on either side of the car. Pretty much symmetrical on the Sauber with this additional spine cooler here. Well, let's bring in the package they're running this weekend in Mexico. And you can see the difference. It's much more open on the side of the car. You've still got that spine cooler there as well. There's a big long fin heat exchanger radiator underneath the bodywork here. And then you can see here where I've just drawn some arrows on top of it. You can see they do also have the set of 4 louvres either side, with slightly larger louvres on the right-hand side than on the left. But you can also see that Sauber has left a bit of scope to open them up even more with a little bit of tape over the rear section of that louvered panel. It doesn't look particularly high-tech, but that's all it is, but it's just in case the car is slightly undercooled. But again, you can see the right-hand side cooler is slightly bigger than the left because it's a Ferrari power unit underneath, but Sauber has its own transmission at the rear of the car compared to the Ferrari unit, which is used both by Ferrari and the Haas team. And now, speaking of Haas, Haas haven't introduced a new cooling package this weekend, but they have used one we've seen before. And again, it's the same trend. Look, same as the Sauber, you have a spine cooler, much smaller on the Haas though than on the Sauber. Then you have a big set of cooling louvres either side, but note the slight different shape at the rear of the cooling louvres for the car. A little bit more abrupt on the left-hand side. Again, slightly asymmetric layout on the car, and that's even more obvious on this car, where you look at the cooling gills on the top of the side pod. You see right through to the heat exchanger there. Now look how different those slots are to the ones on the left. Again, left-hand side, slightly smaller than the right-hand side. So Haas clearly following Ferrari's lead on their cooler layout. And that's not a surprise. They buy pretty much all of the mechanical bits from Ferrari. They do have to design their own cooling layout, but it can be pretty similar because obviously it is. But one team that has got a slightly different layout to what we've seen all year, and the team that's really been surprising me with the lack of cooling we typically see on their car, is Racing Bulls. This is how the Racing Bulls car generally appears, with almost no cooling louvres whatsoever anywhere on the bodywork. You can see that they have this pretty smooth bodywork. It's a low drag solution. We've asked the team about it and they just go, yeah, we like it, it works for us, and it doesn't seem to overheat the Honda power unit. But even Racing Bulls at the altitude of Mexico City have had to introduce a very small set of cooling louvres. Now, when you compare that to the set of louvres you see on the Sauber or even the Ferrari, and then you take a look back at the Racing Bulls layout, you start to learn that maybe Racing Bulls have got something a little bit clever in terms of their cooler layout, or they're willing to push the Honda power unit a bit harder than Red Bull. I don't think they are. I just think Racing Bulls might have some really clever technology with their coolers, and it's something they're not really willing to talk about. I do like all the little bulls on the bodywork here. Nice little detail on that car. Finally, for the very last time for Mexico City, as far as we know, I'm going to talk about the Renault power unit. Renault leaving Formula One at the end of the season. And you see they've opened up the rear bodywork quite significantly, like everybody else sort of has. But when you come to the back of the bodywork, you can see big hole gashes in the bodywork. It almost reminds me of the old Renault days where you see those really serrated cars, yellow and blue cars driven by Fernando Alonso, Jarno Trulli and people like that. And then you come right to the rear bodywork and you can see the cooling exit. And the reason I bring this up is actually surprising how small this cooling exit is at the back of the Alpine. One of the reasons I think Alpine have been able to make it slightly smaller than I would have expected is, and you can just about see it here, they've got a little bit of a gurney or a wicker running around just the trailing edge of that rear bodywork section. And I think what that does is just create a little bit of a stall in the airflow just ahead of that aperture, which allows more air to be drawn out from underneath the bodywork. Now that's just my guess. I haven't put the car in the wind tunnel. I don't know. It's an assumption, but I do think it's a correct assumption. And I think Alpine have turned up with something quite interesting for this weekend. It does seem to be working for them, unlike the rest of the season so far, but they are using last year's car in 2025 as they focus all of their efforts on 2026. But not every team on the grid, as we've already seen, is focused on 2026. Red Bull very definitely focused on the 2025 Drivers' Championship fight. And I tell you, I think this is going to be one hell of a fight and it's going to be brilliant to watch. So stay tuned here on Tech Talk, because I think engineering is going to decide this fight rather than pure driver skill.